All right. Welcome to Halitics. So glad to be talking today. It is Tuesday, and I'm really excited to have a new guest on the program. Diane Perlman joins us on Halitics for the first time. Welcome, Diane, and how are you today?
I'm fine, and I really appreciate your inviting me to be on the show, and I'm excited about having this opportunity to dialogue with you and reach more people.
Well, I think one thing that was really exciting for both of us is when we met at a pro-Palestine, pro-peace event in downtown DC, finding people who feel very similarly appalled by, saddened by, angered by the genocide happening right now. And I think many of us feel alone. Is that right? In our grief?
Yes, but I do. And the way you framed the problem, the rally, which as a pro-Palestine, which it was that, but I think that in our, one of the things I'll talk about that it's an issue is the way we frame things in dualistic terms, and that people believe if you're pro-Palestine, then you have to be anti-Israel, all or nothing framing, whereas if you say it's an anti-violence or anti-war or anti-massacre, and one of the problems which we can get more into is the divisiveness and the really psychological hysteria, political hysteria that's going on about that, and framing things as pro-Palestine fuels a lot of the conflict in public discourse than if you would just, it's not
Well,
not,
is
but
that
that's
is
kind of
that
what,
the fault of the person who says pro-Palestine, or is that the fault of the person who interprets the situation as either pro-Palestine or pro-Israel, rather than saying pro-Palestine means pro-people, pro-human being?
and against violence. And I don't think in terms of fault, but so by background, I'm a clinical psychologist and also now a political psychologist. But, in therapy, there's a lot about framing and language and how do you reach people. And words and frames can either, shut down thinking, or they can open people up, or they can be provocative or trigger things, or be more conducive to dialogue.
Well, let's examine this headline then. This is from today: 55 Palestinians killed in Gaza. And the headline is very, very direct. The subject: Israel kills 55 more Palestinians. That headline will definitely trigger, quote, pro-Israel folks. I mean, they'll say, no, it's the fault of the idea of Hamas. We didn't really kill them. Hamas uses those Palestinian people as human shields and puts them in harm's way. So it's not our fault that they got between the Hamas terrorist murderers and our bullets. I mean, how can we? I mean, language is always going to offend some people. Should we not focus on trying to be as accurate and truthful as we can in the way we describe events?
Right. Well, you can be accurate and truthful and also frame things in a way that is demystifying. And this morning on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, there was a segment on yesterday that there were 200 activists from Jewish Voice for Peace wearing our red T-shirts that say "Not in Our Name," that were arrested in front of the stock market in Wall Street on Indigenous Peoples Day. So I think if you frame things as, Jews against Palestinians, it's not necessary, because there's a win-lose orientation, and our culture, we're gripped by it, and our culture is saturated by that, and our two-party system, creates a dualistic mentality, like in this box and you're in that box, and I have to disagree with you. And so there's a lot of concrete, all or nothing, us, them thinking, whereas it's not, I'm more interested in problem solving, like how do we reverse cycles of violence? And also there are issues of identity or pride or, you know, growing up with identifying with the state of Israel or thinking of it as a homeland and all these positive associations that feel threatened by what's going on now. And the actions of the Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich government, you can argue that they're not making Israel more secure. And that you can objectively say that Israel has become the most hated country in the world now. It's really a hard time to be a Jew and to be associated with this and to witness what's going on. And that the United States and Israel are being isolated, and also that we're sowing the seeds for future violence. I mean, I'll give you one example that when we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, so there were children then that were like 10 boys who were separated and traumatized, and then like 10 years later, they became the Taliban. So there are people now that are being humiliated and traumatized and devastated, and actually also Israelis, and there's things that are being seared into their soul that are going to create a desire for revenge. Look, on 9/11, the next day, all these people signed up to join, you know, young men signed up to join the military to take revenge. And when you attack people on their identity, you strengthen their identity. And it has the exact opposite effect. There's something called the law of opposites. So if you're thinking in concrete terms, like we're going to defeat Hamas, and like everyone, you know, most people will agree with that. Of course, it's obvious that you have to defeat Hamas, but you can't, that the more you try to defeat Hamas, the more you increase recruitment, and it has the exact opposite effect. And after 9/11, the war on terror, actually terrorism increased like sevenfold in the years after the war on terror. So it's not like I'm right and you're wrong, or good or bad. It's more like what are the dynamics? What is the cause and effect? How do you reduce tension? How do you reverse cycles of violence? How do you address trauma?
So that all makes perfect sense to me. I'm with you. Right now, though, we're seeing kind of just the opposite, right? I mean, not only has Israel expanded its military operations north into Lebanon, they're continuing to occupy and subdivide the West Bank. And the murder rate in Gaza by the Israeli military has not declined, although some predicted it might, because the army would be diverted to other theaters of operation. Tragically, there hasn't even been that tiny little silver lining where Gaza might get a little bit of a respite, because the Israeli murder machine was focused on other theaters of operation. It also appears that we are likely to be drawn into some kind of, we're already being drawn into a war with Iran, which will lead to ever more devastation and leave us all less safe. So I guess my question to you is, what do we do? I mean, how does political psychology help us try to stop our country from doing exactly the wrong thing?
Right. And also, I just want to say, as far as those numbers go, that there are estimates that people like Ralph Nader and Jeffrey Sachs are talking about that are more like closer to 200,000 or
hundreds of thousands. Absolutely. The Guardian, Lancet have come out with numbers much higher. I'm going with the official count. We know those are identified. I often say at least an estimated or a minimum. I guess there I said an estimated. It should have been at least a minimum of, which is my usual verbiage, but I got it wrong there. You're absolutely right. The numbers are woefully undercounting the dead, many of whom are buried in rubble. And so the situation is that bad. You've seen it firsthand. You've been to Israel. You've been to Gaza. Maybe you can elucidate from your observations what has resulted from what you saw. That what you saw and how it led to what we're seeing now.
Okay. Well, first I want to say that I haven't been there for a long time, that I spent my junior year at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1970 and 71. And then since then, I've been back several times, and my former in-laws live in Israel and are prominent in Israeli society. So I've been there many times since, and I have family and friends there. The last time I was there was in 2013 at a conference of the International Society of Political Psychology. And I was in Gaza in 1997 and 1999. And I met Dan Ellsberg, who's the father of whistleblowers who exposed the Pentagon Papers in 1995. And he inspired me to do research on moral heroism and the courageous personality. So I interviewed him, and he introduced me to several leaders in the peace movement in Israel and Palestine. And they were actually meeting for a conference about Mordechai Vanunu, who was the Israeli whistleblower who exposed Israel's nuclear program, who got severely punished for that. So anyway, Dan Ellsberg introduced me to Ayad Siraj, who is a psychiatrist who was the founder of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. So I interviewed Ayad when he was in Philadelphia, maybe around 96. And he invited me to come to the Gaza Community Mental Health Program for their conference on health and human rights in 1997. So I was there in 97 and also 99. And that's when I did my first presentation on the psychology of terrorism. And just here's the program book. Let's see, can I, from that. And I have a chapter in here called The Psychoanatomy of Political Terrorism. So, and when I was there in 1997, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program was a very premier mental health program, a very, very high quality. And at the time, children were having nightmares and bedwetting, and they were doing a lot of work then. So even 27 years ago, whatever, children were being traumatized and impacted. And now it's obviously, orders of magnitude worse. So I just want to say something. You mentioned about Iran. In the year 2007, here in Washington, um, we started having meetings. My friend Andy Shalal, who's owner of the Best Busboys and Poets restaurant, some people may be familiar with, started having meetings. We started getting together there regularly to talk about the threat of war with Iran. And also, I've gone to several APAC, American, Israel, whatever, not as an attendee, but as press. I've also gone to every J Street conference in Washington and a few Jewish Voice for Peace conferences and Tikkun conferences started by Michael Lerner, who started Tikkun magazine, who sadly recently died, who was also a friend. So anyway, I've been very out there, present, participating. And in 2007, I went to my first APAC conference. And it was a fear fest. And they were really beating the drums for a war with Iran. So since 2007, and periodically since, there's been beating the drums of war with Iran. And it's, of course, escalating now. And there's an expression, an old expression that goes, to lose a friend is a tragedy, but to lose an enemy is a catastrophe. So it's always useful to have an enemy to inspire support and to drive, funding for the military industrial complex, and as a distraction from domestic issues and all sorts of things. So right now, I want to talk a little bit about propaganda and demonization of Iran. And people are very gripped by this image of the enemy and how violent they are. And I want to say at that in 2007, Ahmadinejad was the president, and he was a good target. He was easy to provoke a lot of animosity. But right now, Iran just elected a new president, Pezeshkian, who's a reformist who's trying to engage with the West. And in 2015, we had the Iran nuclear deal, the joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. And that was like a first step in reducing tension. And there are a lot of young people in Iran. It's a very highly cultured society. There are a lot of young entrepreneurs that were very excited, that didn't want to be a pariah state, that wanted to be part of the West. And it was really the beginning of an opening that could have been built on. I mean, of course, we have a very monolithic image of the enemy, demonization of them. And of course, Trump, I think one of the worst things he did was to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, which of course, what do you expect them to do? And we're sending a message to other countries like North Korea after what we did to Libya and other countries that the only way they can be safe from us is to develop a nuclear program to deter us. So anyway, I just want to talk a little bit about Iran, that on April 1st, Israel attacked their embassy in Damascus and killed a lot of higher level officials, which was very out of bounds, but the US sort of colluded with that and accepted that and didn't challenge it. And of course, when they do something like that, you have to expect that they're going to want to retaliate. Just as, like, how could you expect that they wouldn't? And they waited a long time. And, I have Israeli
Yeah,
friends.
well, let me just jump in real quick, Diane, because one of the points you've made when we've had conversations is what a powerful and rallying force humiliation is. If you humiliate somebody or you humiliate a group, they are going to coalesce against you. They are going to try to find out any way they can to get back at you. And what Israel did sounds like it was international humiliation, right? They went into another country, they bombed it, they were completely acted with complete immunity and impunity. And the United States said to Iran, you just have to take it, suck it, too bad.
Right.
So in some way, that kind of pressure that we boxed Iran into a very tight box is going to explode.
Yeah. So just to trace humiliation a little bit, that before October 7th, the Nakba was humiliating, and the Palestinians have lived under decades of humiliation. And then their children are now seeing their parents being humiliated and even crossing the checkpoints. And that they tried nonviolent strategies first, and that according to needs theory, people prefer to get their needs met by decent means, and they'll always try that first. And then when they're repeatedly rejected, then they resort to more and more devious means, which is predictable. But then so they have a constant, chronic, enduring, long-term, unrelenting daily humiliation. But on October 7th, that Israel experienced a sudden humiliation and narcissistic rage. It's called. I'm just reading an article by a friend of mine, David Lotto, who's a psychoanalyst, who just wrote about this narcissistic rage and humiliation and the compulsion for the urge for revenge to rectify things. So, so then you retaliate and you get into cycles of retaliation. But, I'll try to be concise then, that Iran did not retaliate right away after April 1st. And they were really deliberating on how to respond without escalating and without provoking a war. I mean, they could have, someone mindless, like maybe the United States, for example, could have made a fast retaliation, or Israel, that would have killed a lot of people. So they did something that was very strategic, that they had military targets. They gave several hours notice, and they gave the US and Jordan opportunity to shoot down their drones, which is also a way of collecting information and surveillance to see where they would respond. So they didn't kill anyone, but you would never know that from the media. It's just like, oh, that's terrible, or they failed because they didn't kill anyone. They didn't intend to kill anyone. They didn't want to escalate, but they wanted to send a message that they can penetrate. They had the capacity, and the message was, don't attack us, because we're showing you what we can, a tiny sample of what we can do. And they did something very inexpensive. They used very old drones and things that they didn't need anymore. They had much that they could afford to use up. Then Israel more recently assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, when he was negotiating a ceasefire deal, and people don't realize how painful or how humiliating it is. And then also recently, when they assassinated Nasrallah, like, we're sort of like glib over here, like, oh, good, they're glad that we're dead, and the Lebanese people are going to be happy to get rid of him. And they have no idea. They did not tune into the grief or the symbolism or what he meant to them. And he was also negotiating a peace deal. But like, how do you expect to assassinate leaders like that and not provoke retaliation? So I'll just be brief. But then anyway, then October 1st, they retaliated. One person was killed by accident falling debris, but they didn't intend to kill anyone. They did military targets. They did the targets of the F-15s that were where the source of the attack was. They assassinated Nasrallah while he was doing a peace deal, and when he was at the inauguration of President Pezeshkian in Iran, the reform leader. So that was really humiliating. But if you look at the U.S. press and the Israeli propaganda, it said, like, oh, they failed. They wanted to kill people, but they didn't kill anyone because we shot them down. Whereas the story, and this is also based on what's your source of information, but I've listened to like 30 different people, including military analysts and intelligence and CIA people and Israelis and Jews and think tanks and etc. So let's say they're sending a message. The message is, we don't want to kill anyone. We're not crazy. We don't want to escalate. They're improving their relationship with others. They're evolved. They want to have good relationships with other countries in the region, and they want to be a serious player in the region. But then the message that is propagandized is, they failed. They really wanted to kill people. We shot them down. We have to retaliate. So there's a problem with disinformation.
I mean, all this is, I mean, it's true. And we're the bad actor. We and Israel are the killers, the mass murderers. So again, I get back to my previous question as a political psychologist. And I know that language I'm using is not like language that's designed to bring people together. I think at this point, there's a villain. I mean, if you have a serial killer, that you have to say, okay, well, this person is not somebody that we can work with, that we can negotiate with. They are using all of their cunning, all of their power, all of their influence to kill people. And that is exactly what Israel is doing right now. And frankly, that's exactly what the Biden-Harris administration or Harris-Biden administration is doing right now, and possibly probably what Trump will do if he is elected. So at least when it comes to Israel, Palestine. So is there anything we as ordinary citizens who have some humanity left inside of us can do? Or do we just, I don't know, smoke them if you got them?
Right. Well, there's a concept called the mirror image of the enemy. So in the 1950s, there was a social psychologist called Yuri Brauffenbrenner. He was visiting the Soviet Union, and he noticed that they said the same things about themselves that we said about ourselves, and they said the same things about us that we were saying about them. So that there's a mirror image of the enemy where each side believes that we're noble, just, and true, and the other side is hostile, evil, and aggressive. And there's something called the ultimate attribution error, which is we attribute our behavior to, we're doing this, we're peace-loving people, and we don't want to do this, but we have to do this because they're making us and we have to. But their behavior is because of who they are. They're doing that because they're evil, but we're doing this because of our situation. So each side says the same thing. So this image...
attribution theory, as I understand, is we do good things because we're good people. They do good things if they have no other option. They do bad things because they're bad people. We do bad things if they really are bad because we have no other choice. So we attribute all of the good things that we do to our good qualities, our good traits. I've always struggled with attribution theory because I do just the opposite. I always blame my character for bad things that I do and think, well, I had no really other option but to do this if it results in a positive outcome. So I always struggle with it because I do just the wrong thing. You're supposed to think good of yourself and bad of others, but I don't have so much trouble with the second part. But yeah, no, attribution theory, right? We attribute like what Israel says about Hamas, well, we have no choice but to slaughter all of them. We have no choice but to put bullets in the head of their children, because if they grew up, they would follow the Hamas charter, which doesn't even say to kill all Jews. It just says that Israel should be free from the river to the sea. So again, I get back to my question. This is all horrible. It's all true. Do we as ordinary citizens have any actions we can take to rein in these evil malefactors who run our country and who run Israel?
Right. Okay. So just as long as you put that image up, I just said there are two different ways of looking at the world, whether you see us in opposition and concrete, us, them thinking, or whether you see the vase or the container, that we're all in this together, or whether you look at blame or whether you look at cause and effect and dynamics. But if you could you put up the chart on the suffering, on the formulas for terrorism?
All right, give me a moment. I'll get to that.
Okay. All right, so
I'm not sure I have a chart, but go ahead and describe
the black one. You had it up. It's the black one that said suffering. You had that up before.
Okay, go ahead. I'll have it for you in just a moment, Diane. Go ahead.
All right. So therefore, I kind of pick up decipher formulas, like psychological formulas. So, well, the first thing you have to do is reduce tension. I also want to acknowledge that I had the privilege of knowing and working with Johann Galtung, who's the father of peace studies and the founder of Transcend International and the Transcend Method. And he just died in February at the age of 93. And so the part of the Transcend Method is, one is you have to satisfy basic human needs. And you have a chart up there. I mean, in addition to food, water, shelter, basic human needs are dignity, identity. And I want to make a point about dignity, the opposite of humiliation, and that in the Talmud, it's a crime to humiliate someone in public. And that's very wise, because humiliation is at the source of violence. Say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for violence. But if you look at people committing violence, that they were humiliated, and it's like you're filled with poison and you have to expel it into the other. It makes a psychic imprint. Yes. So basic these are non-negotiable needs, which means that you can't renounce that no one can renounce them except the person that has them, that everyone needs safety, security, identity, dignity, a sense of agency over their own lives, self-determination, equality, equity, and freedom. So the first thing you have to identify basic human needs. And then Johannes talks about that you identify compatible goals. So their conflict is about incompatible goals. So you try to find a way to bridge incompatible goals and create a new reality. But I think one thing is that we have to look at cause and effect and try to understand the causes of violence. And also it is being driven by the military industrial complex, and that, hundreds of billions or $1 trillion that are being made on the war in Ukraine and on this war, and all of the money. And that's a driving force. And I don't attribute it to human nature. Like we say, war is part of human nature. I don't agree with that. And Jerome Frank, who was he was one of the founders of Physicians for Social Responsibility and also Psychologists for Social Responsibility. And he wrote a book called Persuasion and Healing about psychotherapy, and also sanity and survival in the nuclear age. But he said, war is not required by human nature, that it has to be learned in every generation. And we're not, all right, I can talk about this slide. So
Well, no, I want to talk about, I put that up because I think it goes to, the yin and yang, right? The two sides of it. But in terms of human nature, look, you go, what's arguably the greatest poem ever written is the Iliad, which is about a war that happened 3,000 years ago, something like that. So I think we should acknowledge as human beings that the desire to be powerful, to dominate others, to have control, to take ownership of resources, that is in our genes. I mean, that's something that we've evolved with. We need to create a society where we're not incentivized to hurt others, and when those who do hurt others are suffer consequences as a result, not that they are rewarded the way they are now. But I do think there's no question that there is violence inside of pretty much all of us. Some of us are peacemakers more than we are killers, but it is part of our genetic legacy.
I don't exactly, well, I don't see it that way, but I think that, well, also we talk about this as a human issue, but there's also a very powerful gender dynamic to it. And that, I mean, wars and all this is by males, and humiliation is experienced different way. I mean, because it's not inherent in males, but it's sort of the way masculinity is warped and socialized in our culture. Of course, they're healthy, integrated, balanced males, but males being punished and for being tenderness or being forced to identify with powerful leaders and to suppress tender emotions. And also the whole military enterprise. The patriarchy is not about male and female. I think it's Judith Butler, maybe someone, that patriarchy and patriarchal authoritarianism is a system of hierarchical domination, where some males dominate other males and they dominate women, children, animals, and nature.
Well,
So
there's huge, big benefits. If you're a dominating male, the benefits are tremendous, right? You have lots of women at your disposal to bear your children. And so the gene that impels you, or the genes that impel you to dominate others and take power and hold others in dominion, are most likely to be passed down to the next generation.
but it's not necessary, because you can certainly have equality between the sexes and comfort with each other and not needing to have extreme sex roles.
It's definitely not necessary, but I mean, I feel so strongly about this. I'm not saying it's okay. This is just in our genes. And there's plenty of there's plenty of benefits to being peaceful. I don't doubt it. In fact, it's true, because if you're peaceful, you're less likely to get killed in a war. And that means you'll be at home and able to reproduce, whereas if you're dead, you can. But on the other hand, there are tremendous genetic benefits to being Genghis Khan, right? I mean, they say 10% of all children in Eurasia are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. So one of the world's worst mass murderers did pass his genes on to many, many, many millions of people.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about the slide since you have it up, but I just want to mention that there's Ryan Eisler, who wrote The Chalice and the Blade and the Partnership Society. It's sort of that, if you look back in archaeology, there was a period of matriarchy, which was more undifferentiated, and then there's sort of like patriarchal and domination of hordes and all this empire and expansion. I mean, that's male enterprise is like getting more and more and more and expanding more and more and more. And that's also intrigued me, like how human beings could do that, or how you could sustain these gigantic empires, or the compulsion to keep acquiring more and more power and dominate. I mean, it's about domination. And so now she's talking about a partnership society where, with the women's, that we're coming more into equality, or the way for us to be as a society is to have more balance between the sexes and equality and collaboration. So I just want to throw that out. This slide is that one thing I noticed is, with an act of terrorism, that there's a role reversal. And in psychoanalysis, there's a concept of projective identification, traumatic reenactment and projective identification, which is in another slide, which maybe we'll get to. But if you look at 9/11, I just want to talk about rage and revenge. If you look at after Pearl Harbor, immediately they rounded up all these Japanese people and put them into, detention camps, concentration camps. If you look at 9/11, like the next, we had the war in Iraq, that there's a trigger of that kind of sudden humiliation. And there was a massacre in Iraq, Haditha, that there were some soldiers and some of their members were killed. They just went on a rampage and they killed all these innocent families and children sleeping in their tents. So there's some trigger of like that you're filled with something and you have to expel it by going on a rampage. And I call it like going berserk. These are berserkers. And I just looked it up recently. It means bear shirt. They become like animal, like in a trance-like state and just go with revenge. So, so you're filled with this and you deposit into the other. So like in psychoanalysis, if you have a safe container and a good working relationship with someone, they can their trauma may come up and they'll deposit into the therapist, into the other, some of their intolerable affect. And then you feel like what it's like to be them. And when you're suffering, you like wish the other person would know how you feel. Or like, I wish they knew how I feel. Or you maybe not want them.
Well, and people fantasize too, right? They fantasize that people in power, if they only knew what I'm going through, they would be on my side. It's very tough to acknowledge that leaders, especially leaders you may have supported in the past, are indifferent to you or often hostile, in fact, to your interests.
Right. So I call that the perverse desire for empathy. So anyway, the last slide is that the most recent one is say like Israel felt that they were powerful and the Palestinians felt helpless. Can you put back the last one? And then we'll come back to this one. So you reverse. So then the next day that the Hamas felt in power and then Israelis felt helpless. And they felt in control. So it reverses the psychological role. So it's sort of like you're depositing your psychological intolerable affect. So if you just switch roles, so let's say that that Hamas felt helpless, victimized, dominated, inferior, envious, humiliated, and terrorized. And then the next day they felt more powerful. They want to become master of their fate and control, proud. So now we can go to the next slide. So there's a psychological reversal of roles. So if you go to the slide on suffering.
Yeah, just give me a moment. I just getting it up for you right now.
So it occurred to me that the root of, if you want to understand, so after 9/11, like people were objecting like to psychological understanding of terrorism. Like if you understand it, you're just excusing it, and we can't excuse it. You just have to think that they're evil. So my take on that is that we want to prevent terrorism in the future, and if we want to prevent cycles of violence and not multiply it sevenfold by our global war on terror and the law of opposites, and if you eliminate eliminating terrorists is the opposite of eliminating terrorism. So if you're concrete and you want to kill terrorists, you're increasing terrorism. So if you want to eliminate terrorism, you have to understand the dynamics. So first, I'm going to go on the right side.
Well, I think that there's so much to unpack. Let's just talk about that for just a moment. We can get into this slide. But when you're talking about terrorism, I think it's very interesting. I got into a discussion with a gentleman about this exact issue, and I pointed out that England managed to stop the terrorism by the IRA when they negotiated with the IRA in the 1990s and came to an agreement where England was going to be completely out of Ireland altogether. They had a referendum in Northern Ireland where there was a vote to stay part of the UK, but that by negotiating, by conversations, that led to peace. We no longer have bombs going off in central London. So you're absolutely right. There are better solutions. There are solutions. Killing endless war is not one of them. And, it's not always that satisfying, right? Even from a case of pure justice, one of the IRA leaders, Jerry Adams, pretty probably really did commit cold-blooded murder, and he got away with it because the decision was made, well, we don't want to we're going to have to negotiate, and one thing we'll negotiate is Adams gets some immunity for some of the real crimes he committed that weren't even terrorism, just killing people. So I think sometimes you have to kind of bite a bullet and take something you're not really thrilled with, because the result, the alternative is worse. And England had to take responsibility because they had been persecuting and oppressing Ireland for centuries, and they had created a situation where the Irish were understandably very, very angry at them, which is what Israel really needs to do with respect to October 7, is say, well, we've been doing terrible, terrible things for 75 years, and this is the fruits of what we've done. But they're absolutely unwilling to do it. Interestingly, one more point, Diane, I'll let you get right back on. The hostage families seem to get this. Even though they would be the ones you might think would be most demanding some kind of revenge, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But they're saying, no, stop the killing. We need to have talks, negotiations. That's how our family members will be home. And in the end, we won't have the situation where an eye for an eye leaves us all blind. So there's a lot of nuances here.
Right. And the hostages that were released early on was through negotiations. And actually, there was a proposal, I think in May, and the six hostages that were murdered, I think it was in August, that they were set to be released, and that they were taken as collateral for negotiation for a release. So Israelis were trying to liberate them, try to get them out, and they wouldn't, and Hamas killed them because the only reason that they took them was for negotiation purposes, and also because Israel, they rescued 4 and they killed like 270 people. So they would have been, if there was a deal, they would have been released alive. But anyway, I get to the chart. So all right, so the source of terrorism is suffering, and this was inspired by a talk I went to with Robert Stellero at the Division of Psychoanalysis, like in the 1990s, and he was talking about a 2-stage theory of trauma and pathology. So if you're traumatized, that you reach out for help, that trauma itself doesn't have to cause psychopathology. It doesn't have to be pathogenic. So if you have trauma, if you reach out for help and you're comforted and healed and protected, then you can process your trauma and recover and move on to, and maybe have post-traumatic growth. But if you are traumatized and you reach out for help and you're rejected, then it sort of plunges you into a realm where it becomes pathological. So I'll go into that more deeply, but first let's go on the green side on the right. So if you're suffering and you reach out for help nonviolently, if help responds to nonviolent appeals, which could be requests or protests or petitions or any kind of nonviolent demonstrations or appeals, then people are calmed down. It meets your non-negotiable basic human needs for comfort and dignity, and then it contains the conflict, and then you can have truth and reparative justice processes, and you can look at the causes of the suffering and you can correct them, and then there's such a thing as post-traumatic growth, that some people under the right conditions can actually grow after their trauma. And psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton talks about a survivor's mission, that some people will have a mission to correct things, to prevent what happened to them. So that's how you reverse cycles of violence and how you prevent terrorism. So on the other side, on the red side on the left, that if help fails and nonviolent appeals are rebuffed, then you have dejection, humiliation, despair, and rage. Then you transform from being the victim that it's intolerable to be the victim and you want to be master of your fate. And then you compensate for a feeling of helplessness by identification with a powerful leader who will stand up to the enemy. So in this case, Hamas, and by the way, I just want to say that Hamas was created by Israel as an alternative to the PLO, but that's another story. Anyway, so that if a leader stands up to the enemy, that they have an appeal for some people, not everybody. And then you can evacuate the suffering, like being filled with poison and intolerable affects, into the other through acts of terrorism. And then it creates traumatic reenactment by retaliation and revenge, and that causes more suffering, and then it cycles back. So, yeah, the first thing to do is to try to contain what's going on. And, people say, well, like, what would Israel do? So I want to say that Israel did have a right to self-defense on October 7th, which they neglected. That would be self-defense. But they could have secured the borders and brought in international forces and done other things to protect themselves, to ensure safety. What they're doing now is not ensuring any safety.
Well, they could have stopped oppressing Palestine, or they could have at least started the process of stopping the oppression of Palestine, which is, again, what the UK did to finally stop the terror by the IRA. So there were things Israel could have done, and the United States also could have pressured Israel to do those things rather than going again in the completely wrong direction, which was to supply them with weapons of genocide. You're a political psychologist. We don't have that much more time, so I just want a few more questions. I know you've got a meeting also after this, which you definitely should attend, which is on this topic. But just a couple of questions. Is there a way, I mean, my solution, because I asked you for solutions, my solution right now is we have to move away from the duopoly, the two-party system, the unitary system, party, whatever you want to call it, both sides enthrall to the corporate military elites. That means voting for Jill Stein. As a political psychologist, in my opinion, you may have a different view, which is fine. But from my perspective, how would you recommend as a political psychologist I use the tools of psychology to persuade people that they need to abandon Harris and Trump and go third party, or go emerging party, which is a better term that I think you shared with me at one point?
Yeah, an emerging party. Yeah. I mean, I think at this point, everything is a done deal. And I think that this election is going to be a disaster, kind of no matter what happens. And, by voting Jill Stein, it's a signal and it's a message to the duopoly about that. I mean, people are thinking of their votes tactically or strategically, more tactically and strategically. But I think we should just work day and night. The election.
Well, then let me rephrase the question a little bit. How do we persuade people after the election that they've got to move in a different direction? That even if it's too late now to change it's baked in the cake, that we're going to either have one or the other genocider in the White House. How do we change that going forward? How do we unite people so they say no more? We will not accept this, regardless of whether Team Blue or Team Red is in power.
Yeah, well, I think we're on a big learning curve. Okay, I mean, I know things now that I had no clue about years ago. Even like every day, I learn more things, and I think people are gonna, I think tide is turning in the American public about U.S. As a collusion with, I don't like the term support. Like, I don't think we're supporting, this is not supporting Israel. I think we're colluded, that the United States is using Israel as our battering ram, as our foreign legion forces, except we now just sent 100 people over there with the THAAD missile who are going to be vulnerable to be attacked. that the United States is using Israel, and it may appear like Israel is using the United States back, but I think U.S. is using them as our unsinkable carrier battleship in the Middle East, as our source of power in the Middle East. And it's not helping Israel. In fact, Henry Kissinger said that to be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be America's friend is fatal. So if you look at our friends like Israel and Ukraine, they're both in horrible, horrible shape. And the big winners are the defense contractors, the weapons sale, Boeing,
Yeah,
Lockheed Martin.
when I've
Yeah,
been called a
they're
Putin
angry.
puppet, I respond with "You're a Lockheed lackey."
And we're being psychologically. I'm very interested in psychological manipulation of fear and exaggeration of the image of the enemy and mustering up fervor and support for like going after bad guys. And every war, I mean, in 1970, I was at Columbia University in the strike of 1970, opposing the Vietnam War. And every war starts with overconfidence and denial. Like it's going to be a cakewalk, like in 2003. We're going to win. We're so strong. We're right. We're good. They're evil. And denial about the downside, about the negative consequences and the blowback and the unintended consequences, the inevitable, predictable blowback that is absolutely. Before 2003, I wrote a few op-eds, one with my colleague Rich Rubinstein and with my other colleague Mark Pilasek, who from Psychologist for Social Responsibility, who recently died, like emergency warning of what would happen if we invaded Iraq in 2003, and we predicted escalation of violence and trauma to millions of people. And, everything we predicted pretty much happened and more that, we didn't think of. Like, for example, all the refugees going into Europe created all this right wing, this fear of immigrants and the other, and these fascistic governments like in Hungary that wouldn't have happened if they weren't flooded with refugees from the war. It triggered off a lot of feeling of invasion, contamination of the culture, etc. So everyone's focused on like here and now, revenge, concrete black and white thinking, getting even, expelling our terrible, intolerable feelings to make us feel better in the moment. And we're sowing the seeds for cycles of revenge. So, I mean, we're going to need, I think after right now, there's a lot of absorption in the election itself. I think there's going to be chaos. I think there's a high probability. It seems like that Trump could definitely win. Whoever wins, there's going to be hysteria on the other side. And each side is like totally freaked out about if the other side would win. And I think, they both have problems. So I think after that, the chaos, we're going to have to like learn and have like teach-ins and in Israel and Palestine, we're going to have to do like a lot of de-traumatization and truth and not even reconciliation isn't the right word, but like repair. I call it repairology, like a science of repair. And they're going to absolutely need new leadership on both sides and have new leaders rise up who have absolutely nothing to do with the people that got them into this mess. That if anyone is still in power who participated in this, it'll make it near impossible to heal. And they're going to have to be like active, massive interventions of healing and de-traumatization and compensation and repair and mourning and grief and collective rituals to prevent cycle of violence. Like in South Africa, they knew they had to have a truth. If they didn't have a truth commission, there would be a bloodbath. And it was.
Let me ask you this. Is there any ultimate solution to this problem without just a tremendous wealth and income and power redistribution? I'm thinking of the United States. I mean, we're still I guess the impacts of slavery, of the slave system, and rapacious capitalism that kind of in some ways are, goes hand in glove with slavery, are still with us. And it seems to me the only way we could really expiate them is to go back to what we started with the New Deal, which is extraordinarily high wealth and income taxes that lead to ultimately to a situation. And the New Deal left behind many African Americans. There were certain aspects to it that excluded black citizens from getting the full benefits of it. There's some other failures in the New Deal, and then of course the Great Society. But they were very well intentioned and had many positive. I want to focus on the many positive aspects to those two efforts by the U.S. government. So I'm thinking that seems to be what we need, right? Whether it's in the United States or it's in Israel or it's around the world. We need to forcibly take wealth and power from the billionaire class and redistribute it to a point where we all have enough and no one has too much. And if we don't have enough so that we don't have enough so that no one has, so that everyone has enough, right? We'd have to have enough to make sure that everyone has enough. We have to figure out a way to get to that place where we all have those needs, right? You talk about basic needs. Isn't that really where we have to get? And also to prevent some evil malefactors, greedy, selfish, power-mad people from taking power, have very strong laws in effect that just prevent that from happening. You just can't aggregate too much. You can't have too much, period. Power is going to be shared. Maybe you can be president for one term, maybe two, but that's clearly the end of it. And you can't become super rich as a result of your having power either.
All right. Well, what you're saying is really threatening to the billionaires who have a lot of power, obviously. Do you have an image?
I want to threaten them. I want to rally people to view them as the enemy, not necessarily because they're evil or bad people, but because they have so much and everyone else has so little. Maybe they're not even the enemy if they're prepared to disgorge their wealth and power.
Right. So do you have the slide, the formula, like peace equals equity plus harmony divided by...
I didn't put that one. I thought about it. There were a lot of slides, but
Johan has a formula, like it's peace equals, and then there's a equation on top is.
I know what you're talking about. I didn't put that in there, but I know exactly what you mean.
Equity and harmony divided by trauma and conflict. So
see if I can get it real quick, but
that's all right. So
you have to go though, Diane, unless you're prepared to go a little longer, and I promised you I'd have you out. So give us your final word in response to what I said. I'll see if I can find the slide, but yes, that's where I want you to go.
Equity, and we need to find, there's a lot of work. Actually, I have a friend that you could interview who is more articulate and knowledgeable about issues of land and value and economics. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of, we have to educate ourselves. We have to organize. And I think there's a lot of promise. I don't want to put it on the young people, but I think they're less enthralled by the propaganda and the old thought forms, although I'm a baby boomer and, growing up, we were idealistic, age of Aquarius, thinking also we were ideal. The 80s were like a glorious time when we had all these possibility of what society could be, and we were all becoming conscious. So we need to revive that spirit. And I think those in power we need to build power in like the uncommitted movement, and people are starting to see through things, but I think we need to frame it in a way that's less that provokes less defensiveness and fear and retaliation. Okay.
I want to thank you so much, Diane, for joining me on Halitics. What a great honor. Really interesting conversation. Maybe we'll have you back again whenever you want, but good luck. And thanks again. Any final word, or are we done? I'll give you the...
All right. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for the opportunity to...
All right, that'll do it with Diane. What a great honor to have her on with me. Really appreciate that. I will be back tomorrow. Just Hal, no other guests. Looking forward to that as well. Hope to speak to you then. Take care.